So he replies to this person, and this is the single thing on Twitter this entire year that was the best. Here's what he replied. "This is not sexism. Fact. I have roasted more than 250,000 chickens over 15 years. What's your qualifications?"
You're listening to the Taste Podcast. I'm Editor-in-Chief Matt Rodbard, here with Senior Editor Anna Hezel.
Today on the show, we have Helen Rosner, a journalist and currently food correspondent at The New Yorker. We also, later on, I will be talking to Josh G., who is the author of the newsletter Snack Cart. Before we get to Helen and Josh, Matt and I just wanted to chat for a few minutes about what we've been up to this year.
Oh man, this year has gone by very quickly.
Did you cook anything this year?
Yeah, I made some things this year. We've had so many great books that have come out over the year, and I've found some time to actually do some cooking this year.
Incredible. Did you edit any articles this year, or not really your thing?
Not really my thing. I've never edited an article. I just do podcasts. That is a lie. We edit stories all the time, Anna, and I feel like sometimes stories are really fast and they go up in a couple weeks, but oftentimes we spend months around these stories. And we really immerse ourselves in the kind of the narrative. We work with writers. We have rounds and rounds of edits. So we wanted to kind of take some time and talk about some of our favorite stories of the year. Anna, what's your first one that you're thinking about?
One story that I really loved working on this year is called Do You Eat Dog? And it's by Soleil Ho, who has written a lot for Taste. She also is just named as the San Francisco Chronicle new restaurant critic.
Let's pause there and just San Francisco Chronicle got their shit together finally.
She's going to be awesome. I mean, I'm crazy about her writing. I can't wait to read her writing about restaurants. But anyways, she wrote a piece for us about eating dog, which sounds on the surface like it would be like dangerous waters. But she wrote about it so carefully, and so it's kind of unpacking why it's such an overblown generalization.
I know, and when she brought the idea to us, I think we really did have a bit of a conversation about how do we frame this and not make it feel like it was some kind of salacious clickbait. I think that piece will stick around for a while.
I hope so, definitely. Another piece that I really loved working on was with Hannah Georges, who's now a staff writer at The Atlantic. Her piece is Ethiopia and Eritrea's long history with lasagna. And she talked about why lasagna is such an important part of Ethiopian and Eritrean home cooking.
So there's a colonial past? Is there a tie to Italy in some way?
Yeah, it all starts in the 1800s with Italian colonialism. And it kind of is a story of reclaiming this thing that came out of this really ugly history, but making it their own and really weaving it into the food culture of these two countries.
Yeah, and there's a really killer recipe there, which brings up the book.
Yeah.
The book. Let's announce it. We haven't actually properly announced the book. So let's do it on the Taste Podcast. Officially.
This year, we wrote a book about lasagna.
And the funny thing about books is when you write it in the year prior, 2018, they come out a year later. So it'll be out in the fall of 2019.
What about you, Matt? What did you work on this year that really resonated with you and that has been sticking with you?
Well, we've had a number of kind of food histories, and if you look on the homepage of Taste Now, they'll be up there along with some of our favorite stories of the year. But one of my favorites was a story titled "Whatever Happened to Sun-Dried Tomatoes?"
What did happen to them? They were in every pasta salad I ate between 1994 and 1998.
And even before then, Priya Krishna, the author of the piece, who writes often for the New York Times and has a column at Bourdain, wrote beautifully about this kind of quirky food stuff that in the 80s and the early 90s was hot, was in all the major restaurants, was considered exotic, not just for its kind of burst of umami, but because it just had a cool color and added color and shade to kind of bland dishes.
And you had to go to Dina and DeLuca to get it.
Exactly. It was packed in oil. It was imported from Italy. But this piece is great because she pre-interviews some of the major leading lights in the food journalism game from that era, including Dorothy Kalins, the founding editor-in-chief of Saveur, David Camp, who wrote a book called United States of Arugula, covered food history in America. And she gets some great quotes from Ruth Reichel.
I love that. That's perfect.
Ruth's quote is, "They are the example of all the worst qualities of tomatoes," she says, firmly, hard, chewy, not sweet, and without any of the lusciousness you want in a tomato.
Wow, I do not buy that, Ruth. I'm sorry. I love sun-dried tomatoes. They still taste good.
Yeah, I have to disagree. Oh, man. I had another really good story I wanted to point out. It's actually not a story. It's a column. It's from J.J. Good. The column is called America's Best Worst Chef, which I think is very appropriate. Because J.J. Good is known in this building at Penguin Random House as one of America's top cookbook writers and collaborators. But J.J. comes to the conclusion that after these years spent writing cookbooks and presenting these oftentimes complicated theories on food and these recipes that while they work, would you actually make them? That's the question. He's come to the realization that that's not necessarily the way he wants to cook, especially given that he now has, at the time of this column, had a 4-year-old and a 5-month-old.
Wow. Yeah. And JJ doesn't come from a culinary background either. He didn't go to culinary school.
But this column, America's Best Worst Chef, and this piece that he wrote, Permission to Cook Normal Food, is kind of a meditation on the idea of like, what is normal food and is it okay to cook it as a food writer?
Seriously, I mean, because we have a lot of pressure to cook really ambitious cooking projects. What's an example of a normal food? What am I allowed to cook in 2019?
Well, I think he cooks like simple dishes in this column, like the roasting chicken and steak, and he oftentimes gets into a very simple technique more so than an actual food stuff. But I think the point of the column is that busy people cook in different ways, and we love cookbooks, but maybe that idealized world is not how everyone wants to cook.
I love that. I love keeping it realistic, being as ambitious as you want to be, but also just having fun.
Yes, and I wanted to close with some of JJ's writing because honestly, when it comes down to it, this guy is one of our best. When I make dinner, there are 2 cooks in the kitchen. There's the cookbook combing, magazine flipping, DavidLeibowitz.com reading dynamo who sees sweet potatoes on his counter and envisions perching twice roasted hunks on a mint-strewn yogurt sauce-slathered platter, who takes a ribeye from the fridge and muses over ideal treatments, the frequent flip, the reverse sear, the herb butter baste. Then there's the guy who actually makes dinner. That is our year in food, reviewing our own writing. Is that what we just did? Is that what we did?
Yeah, basically. Thanks for listening, everyone, and thanks for reading all year. It's been a great year. Here is Matt talking to Helen Rosner.
Helen Rosner.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for joining the Taste Podcast.
It's so exciting to be here.
I wanted to ask you on, we're doing a little year-end recapping, but I also just wanted to hear about you and how have you been?
Oh my God, that's so lovely of you. I've been really good. Thank you. How are you?
I'm good. It's year-end and, lists and all that stuff.
It's so weird how, like, the end of the year, it feels like time goes so much faster than the rest of the year. Like, it's this... Yeah. Run-on sentence of a month.
I know.
It's horrible.
Well, I've been reading you. I've been reading you in the New Yorker, and I wanted to. It's been great. You've had such a nice year. So many cool stories. So many diverse stories. Tell me just first, our listeners, what is your role at the New Yorker?
I am the food correspondent, which is I correspond about and with food. I write about things related to the world of the edible. on a recent episode of the New Yorker Radio Hour, which is our podcast, David Remnick, the editor of the magazine, described me as not a food critic, which I think is sort of the most efficient way of saying what I do, which is to say what I don't do.
Which is like everything but review restaurants anonymously.
Exactly. Like that's what Hannah
does it.
So, and I write about restaurants, and I write about chefs, and I write about cookbooks and the culture of eating, and I also write about agriculture and business, and as I think you and probably everybody listening to this knows, there's almost nothing that isn't a food story, and there's almost no topic that isn't in some way approachable through the lens of food.
Yeah.
So, the hardest part about my job really is deciding what to write about.
Yeah, it's challenging to like narrow it down to a topic that's worthy of all the time you put into it, right?
Yeah, but also just like there's everything, like do I devote my time to, writing profiles of chefs or up and coming producers, or do I go find restaurant trends, or do I feel like lately I've been doing a lot of what kind of amounts to media criticism, sort of writing about the state of restaurant writing. And that kind of connects to Me Too and all of the sort of reckoning that the food industry has been doing with itself, and, kind of everything.
I really latched on to some of your home cooking stories because I think those are tricky to write because they take a lot of time. They also are done so poorly in other.
Mine?
No, not yours. No, yours are done so well.
We're just throwing down.
No, we ain't throwing down like that. No, I meant in general, people attempted to write home cooking stories and they can come off, I don't know, unprepared or untested. But a couple come to mind. Your double stock story. I loved that. How did you come to that?
Well, it's interesting, or at least gratifying that you say that home cooking stories can often be not great. I've written about home cooking before. I've worked at magazines where we primarily covered home cooking and we were writing for home cooks. But it's really been challenging to write about home cooking this year, which is, along with media criticism and writing about restaurant sexual harassment and whatever. I also write about recipes that I make up in my house. Because it's really easy to fall into what I kind of think of as the stereotypical food blog trap, every couple of months there'll be some massively viral tweet of someone complaining about having to scroll down past 14 paragraphs of my husband and my 3 sons and our golden retriever went to visit the Great Wall of China, and here's the thing that we had for breakfast, and here's the recipe. And I get annoyed by that because you can just fucking scroll. Just get to the free recipe that the internet is providing you at the bottom of this blogger's blog post. But at the same time, I think that it is remarkably difficult to sort of produce a piece of writing that stands on its own from a sort of journalistic or literary perspective, that is connected to a recipe without either the recipe being necessary in order for the piece of writing on top of it to have any function or direction.
We joke
at
about
all.
personal memoir plus a recipe.
Right,
it's
exactly.
like a total side eye about that.
Well, and I think structurally a recipe can serve as a punctuation mark, right? A recipe can replace a kicker in a story. It's you sort of set up this moment, or you set up an experience or a person or a mood, and then you open the door to the recipe, and here's the recipe, and then it's over. And what my editor has pushed me to do, which I she's amazing, and I think she's absolutely right about this. Rachel Ahrens, she's a genius. I hope everybody gets edited by her. It's the greatest pleasure. Which she really pushed me towards, and I think it's the correct way to approach this kind of home cooking writing, is to have the written bit, the essay, the piece on top of it, sort of make its own holistic point that stands on its own, and for the recipe to then be an illustration of the point as opposed to a punctuation of sort of the arc. If that makes sense.
No, it does. And your 2 examples are, this is a really great way to make a roast chicken and prep it, and this is a great way to make stock. Start with the box stock and then do a second stock.
Yeah.
But written in a way that has the New Yorker's literary tradition, and you have fun with it.
I do, yeah. And I think that I'm very fortunate. I think that I can pick and choose what recipes I write about. Right. I don't have to. The New Yorker is not a cooking site, right? We don't have to have 10 new recipes every single day. We don't have to produce a cookbook at the end of every single year, which means that all of the recipes that I choose to write about can be ones that have the stories behind them, which isn't to say that recipes without stories have no value. I mean, they're wonderful. Like, I think that the measure of a recipe is how good is the food. But there are lots of things that I've cooked that I just, like, don't really have anything interesting to say about except this is yummy. And, like, that's an important thing to say. And I think that those are recipes that people who are interested in things that taste good would like to have, and I want them to have it. But it's not the same thing as what, like, we at the New Yorker are kind of providing to our readers who are looking for, like, a sitting down on our couch or in a train or on an airplane kind of reading experience where, you know, you're not necessarily going to
maybe to cook the dish.
Right.
Like, pull it out.
Right, like pull up the grocery list on your phone at this very moment.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I've written, I want to say maybe 4 or 5 in the last year, which is not a ton. And what I've kind of tried to go for with them is to explore a concept, sort of like you said, with the double stock. Like, here's this idea that, you know, probably some of you are familiar with, but maybe not everybody is, which is you can use stock instead of water to make a second stock.
It's called a double stock. It's common in restaurant cooking.
Exactly.
But you really broke it down. Nice.
Yeah, and it's fucking great. Yeah. Like, it's so good. And it's one of those things that just, like, once it enters your cooking repertoire, it changes everything. It's like somebody introducing you to salt. I mean, it's so fundamentally transformative of how you cook. And I just sort of wanted to be like, here's this cool concept, and, like, let's talk about it and break it down. And, you know, that one in particular, the recipe that runs underneath it, like, we really struggled with that recipe because stock is this thing of indescribably infinite permutation. I mean, like, every choice that you make, whether it's, like, you know, the part of the chicken that you're making the stock out of, or whether
the mirepoix, the celery, and the onions,
but the size of the mirepoix starts to matter, or, like, the hardness of your water. If you live in a municipality that has hard tap water or soft tap water, it changes the way that the proteins extract from the chicken. It's, like, so intense. And of course, every cooking experience is infinitely mutable in the same way. You know, like, the humidity will affect your mayonnaise.
Bread baking too.
Right. But there's something about stock where people are like, and I think we expect this in a certain way out of recipes. Like, we think, like, okay, this recipe exists and it's going to produce a result that is going to be replicatable consistently over time. And with stock, it's always fucking different. And I don't think I kept on trying to write a recipe for stock, and it would end up being, and I'm not exaggerating, like 10 pages long, because I was introducing all of these variables. And I was like, you know, there on Serious Eats, I think it was Daniel Gritzer, though it might have been Kenji, did an amazing breakdown of how the different parts of chicken make stocks taste different or look different colors, and genuinely infinite.
Yeah.
And of course, in the classic New Yorker fact-checking tradition, our fact-checker, like, I had this line where I was like, it's infinitely mutable. And the fact-checker was like, can you prove this? Like, that it's in fact infinite? And I was like, oh my God.
Who gives you the backup for that?
I don't know how to prove that, like, my claim. How do you prove infinity? Like,
I mean,
isn't
cooking is infinite, as you said. I think the burner potency is something huge that often we try to negotiate in recipe writing.
Right. Yeah.
Like, is it gas? Is it electric? Is it on full flame? Is it on what is full flame? God,
right.
We could go.
Does it actually touch the pot? Like, is it what? Yeah.
I want to hear about your trip to Japan. Another piece you wrote about as you visited an MSG factory.
I did. Oh my gosh, I do a lot.
I loved that piece. Tell me a little bit more about that, our listeners.
Yeah, well, so I actually was in Japan working on a story for a different publication. I was writing a story for Afar, which is a really wonderful travel magazine. And they do this cool column where it's called Spin the Globe, where in each issue of the magazine, they take a writer and they send that writer, who in this case was me, on a trip somewhere, and you're not told where you're going until the day before you leave. So I knew about 2 or 3 months ahead of time what the dates of my travel were, but I knew nothing else. And then you sort of, like, land and you kind of orient yourself and you figure out who you are and what you're doing, and you write a story about it. And because they sent me to Japan, which was...
Had you ever been there?
No. Oh my God. And it was a dream,
cool,
like a lifelong dream. And my husband and I have talked about going to Japan forever. And when they sent me, I was overjoyed. And then, like, my next emotion was, oh my, like, is this a marital betrayal? Like, this has been what the two of us have wanted to do forever. You know, it's a long flight from New York, and it's a big time change. And so they gave me a trip that was a little bit longer than the ones they usually do. So I had 8 days to just sort of hang out in Japan. And one of the things that I did with my time there, and originally this was going to sort of be part of my Afar story, but the piece that I wound up writing for them went in a different direction, was I spent half a day in this kind of like not like a suburb of Tokyo, but sort of a it had been its own city, and then as Tokyo has sprawled over the last decades, it's sort of been absorbed to the south of Tokyo, this city which is the home to the headquarters of Ajinomoto, which is the world's largest creator and seller of MSG. And they have a factory tour. It's free. You can just sort of sign up and do it. It's all in Japanese, which I don't speak, but I sort of, you could follow along.
They probably had great swag, too, that you could buy, right?
There was an Ajinomoto gift store at the end, which is so cool. And as part of it, like you sort of, it's a huge sprawling factory campus. There are they make a ton of products, like not just straight MSG, but all sorts of, bouillons and potato chips and things like that. But, so, you check out the robots doing things and you drive past the fermentation tanks. And then at the end, we did this sort of hands-on thing where we, put on clean suits and hairnets and covered our shoes and went into a clean room and we filled and weighed and labeled and quality assured our own personal bottles of MSG.
Oh my God, really?
You
have your own?
I do have. It's like a tiny little keychain style bottle of MSG that I put together myself.
We've written at Taste about cooking with MSG, which I think I don't want to spoil your story. I think you should look it up on the New Yorker website and read it. But it's something that is a little misunderstood, the actual application of cooking with it. But you do cook with it,
I do.
assume.
Yeah. I cook with it.
A shaker of it? You get it at your bodega?
Yep.
Yeah.
I keep it next to my stove.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, MSG, fundamentally is kind of equivalent to salt or sugar or citric acid, right? Those are sort of the four things. And I'm forgetting one of the tastes, aren't I? Sugar, salty, sweet, sour, savory. Bitter? Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, vinegar, I guess. But in the same way that you would sprinkle salt onto something or sprinkle sugar into something, you put MSG in and it needs depth and savoriness. It's actually really weird to me that people don't understand what umami is. Yeah. I suspect that some of this is a certain degree of English language chauvinism, where we're like, oh, it's a foreign word, it must be an unparsable concept to our American minds, but it's just savoriness, and everybody knows what savory is.
Think about that flavor then you're walking out of your Japanese restaurant. That's what I always think about.
Well, it's also think about the flavor of a mushroom or
that too,
beef stock or any of those rich meaty flavors. Yeah. And if you actually taste MSG in its crystalline form, kind of like eating salt off your fingertip, where salt has a flavor, not just a sensation, you realize how familiar you are with the taste of MSG because it tastes like chicken bouillon. I mean, it tastes like Doritos, and you're like, oh, this is in everything. Yeah. And
it tastes like home.
It does. Yeah. And we're so hardwired to love that flavor. I mean, human breast milk has an extraordinarily high quantity of glutamic acids. Yeah. So, from the moment that we're born, we're designed to seek out this flavor, and it's evident in all of our eating patterns across everything. And yet, for some baffling and bizarre and kind of just disappointingly racist reasons, we have American culture has developed this really antipathic relationship towards something that we actually really love.
Based on that junk science article from the 80s that you discussed a bit in your piece. But read the piece. I want to switch gears to more of the year in review because it's been a pretty fun year. But Twitter, I actually do a funny thing with your Twitter. I actually read your I mute you, so I'm actually going to admit that I have you muted. Okay. But I actually go back and I read you as a Twitter feed as it's independent. I'm just shining.
No,
I
like that.
I love you on Twitter.
It's a controlled consumption.
Yeah,
I think that
I
makes
need
a lot of
control,
sense.
but I follow through. But tell me, it was a fun question. What was the greatest thing on Twitter this year that happened to you?
To me personally,
or that you observed? Sorry, let's open it up.
Oh my gosh. Oh man, Twitter has been wild this year. Well, the greatest thing that happened to me personally was that earlier this year, I wrote a story and also tweeted, which then led to the story about how when I make roast chicken, I use a hairdryer to dry the chicken, which I imagine anybody who is already aware of this is sick of hearing about. And I'm slightly sick of talking about it, but I'm also obsessed with what I'm about to say, which is I think people who kind of fundamentally understand cooking and chicken in a certain way were like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. You want the skin to be really, really dry. And a lot of people were like, why are you cooking the chicken with your hairdryer, which evidences a sort of misunderstanding of how hairdryers work. But there was a fascinating slice of people who were really mad at me for doing this logical and effective thing, who were not concerned that the hairdryer itself was a problem or drying the chicken was a problem. They were really concerned about like the kitchen sanitation.
The crossing over of
right.
rooms in your house.
Right, like the cross-contamination inherent in the hairdryer. And so there was this guy who flipped out at me on Twitter, and I can't remember his name, but God, he was just amazing. He was this titanic, amazing man who was like, the recipe that you have for chicken here. So like underneath my whole thing that I wrote in the New Yorker about this, I had a recipe for making roast chicken. And I have a peculiar way that I like to cook the chicken too. So it wasn't just about the hairdryer, it was also this cooking method. And I had something where it was like, use an instant read thermometer in the breast and the thigh until they are like, I don't remember what it was, like 180 and 165 or whatever the correct temperatures are, to tell that your chicken is done roasting. And he was like flipping the fuck out at me. And he was like, you're going to kill everybody who eats this. And like, everybody knows that the right way to do this is you just rub oil on a chicken, you put it in the oven, you cook it until such and such a temperature, and then it's done. And I was like, wow, thank you, dude. And then he started crazily doubling down. And
I love the double down. It's great.
I'm setting this up improperly, but I think what you sort of need to envision here is like this man who, I guess in his Twitter history, he has...
Titanic of a man, you said?
Yeah. Well, like
that.
He's basically like tweeted angrily at like FiOS internet service and he's tweeted angrily at me. And that's it. Like that's his entire internet history.
Let's unpack his the sanitation thing.
Well,
so weird.
he was really upset because according to like some FDA guide handbook, the temperature that I had said was like 5 degrees less than what the FDA says is safe consumption. But when you take the chicken out of the oven, it rests for 5 minutes and the temperature continues to rise and you hit it and you're fine. And also the FDA like wildly over errs on the side of safety. I mean, like they don't let us have good cheese, right? Like they're not really looking for culinary quality, right? No. They're looking for sort of plausible deniability for lawsuits.
Are not in place in France and Italy and Japan and everywhere else where there's
everybody's like doing fine.
Yeah, everyone's fine.
So okay, here I found the tweet. So like this guy Chris, I like responded to him kind of sarcastically when he was like, just rub it with grapeseed oil and bring it up to temperature and blah blah blah. And I was like, oh my God, thank you finally for showing me the truth. Like, how could I have been blind for so long? Which is, not super flattering to me that I responded sarcastically, but it's the internet. And somebody responded to me kind of implying that he was mansplaining, which, he's a man and he's telling me how to do this, and who knows if there was a gender component or not. But
by definition, it was close to that.
Yeah. So he replies to this person, and this is the single thing on Twitter this entire year that was the best. Here's what he replied. This is not sexism. Fact. I have roasted more than 250,000 chickens over 15 years. What's your qualifications?
It's a real Kenny Rogers there.
I know. And I was just like, it was like the sun coming out from behind the clouds. Like, it was beautiful. And I think that... and I don't mean this in a mean way. Like, there is such a purity to his rage. He was like, I've cooked like more chickens than the population of the state of New York. Who the fuck are you? Like, I have a method. And of course, it kind of came out that he works at a chicken restaurant and he's cooking chickens in extraordinary volume in a commercial context. And I'm like, I'm making one chicken at a time for a dinner guest. But, God, I've cooked over 15 million chickens, or 250,000 chickens. I'm wildly misrepresenting.
But it was a high amount.
Oh my, I don't know. It delighted me.
I love that memory.
Was
Twitter
that what you
is
were
so
setting
great.
me up to talk about? I feel like you could. I don't know. What was your favorite moment?
Oh man, I don't want to get. I feel like Twitter was a tough one this year for me, but I enjoy Twitter as a news syndication tool. I learn about great content on Twitter. That's kind of what It's such a boring answer. I'm sorry. You turn the tables on me, and I'm unprepared.
I still have the hole in my heart left by Google Reader, Yeah.
And we talked about that. I emailed you about that once, yeah.
And Twitter is sort of the horrible replacement. That old, I think it's a Russian folktale of the wooden mother that came to replace the real mother who died, and she has an evil glass eye, and she forces the children to do chores, and is just embodied by the spirit of hell, and that's Twitter replacing Google Reader.
Twitter is my Google Reader. I wanted to close with a couple thoughts on cookbooks of the year and also some journalism. Just what were 3 cookbooks that you really that you were drawn to this year that you discovered? Doesn't necessarily have to be new cookbooks.
Actually, there are a lot of cookbooks this year that I really, really loved. And, you know, I have it on my mind because I've been writing sort of my own end of year stuff. But I think the new books that just for me are like, I think they're wonderful and they're kind of changing the game. And they have such curiosity and voice and honesty and personality and point of view, have been Seasoned by Nick Sharma, which I just think it's blockbuster. I mean, that's just the book of the year, like no question for me. Anita Lowe's book Solo, which is about cooking for one, I think is revolutionary in a number of ways. I mean, she's not the only person who ever written about solo eating. Clancy Brown's book about it is also really terrific.
Joe Yonan had one too.
Joe Yonan had one. There was that wonderful essay collection a couple of years ago, Alone in the Kitchen with an Eggplant. So, you know, the notion
Judith Jones.
Right. She had an entire book about it.
Yeah.
You know, the notion of eating on your own is not like a new idea, but Anita Lowe's perspective on it is just, she's so dark in a way that I love. Like there's a self-deprecation that is incredibly funny and empowering. And like she has this Valentine's Day recipe that's like a bleeding runny egg on a bitter cheese. I mean, it's funny, but it's not about like the misery of being alone. It's sort of about playing with the expectation that one ought to be miserable and really riffing on that.
Yeah,
and
she really leans into like the concept, right, of the misery or the how dining alone is a big bummer. Did you get to the part about the floating corpse?
Yes. God, she describes in the head notes one of the recipes how she and a date were like walking along the Hudson River and saw a floating dead body, and then they went out for dinner and like, here's the recipe for that. And then P.S.
I love that.
We broke up the next day. I think
know.
it's like, but the other thing is that the food is fucking epic. I mean, Anita is one of the great restaurant chefs of the last
20
years. Yeah. And it's restaurant caliber food, and it's scaled for one person, which is so the opposite of how most restaurant recipes work, where like, you know, this is like, you know, make the chicken stock for 500 people or whatever. And she's like, you know, I made, for example, like she has this incredible recipe for potato gnocchi with mortadella and pistachios and peas. And it starts with like, take one baked potato and microwave it and then scoop out the flesh of the potato and make your gnocchi. And it's like, it blew my mind to just make one portion's worth of gnocchi. There's not enough for seconds, and it's perfect and it's efficient, and it still uses like 70 pots and pans.
Yeah, that's a one beef I have with that book, that there's a lot of prep. But I mean, I love it. It's a cool book for sure.
It's such a great book.
Yeah.
And then you said 3, but I don't know. I love Feast by Anissa Halou, The Food of the Islamic World. It's just like wonderful. There's like Middle Eastern cuisine and the sort of Middle Eastern pantry have been so at the forefront of trendiness right now. And her book is such a deep and rich kind of historical and sociological look at the food of the Islamic world, to quote
really
its subtitle.
Magnum opus at this point. It's a beautiful book.
It's a phenomenal book. And then God, I think there's so many.
No,
it's such a good year.
Yeah, it was a great year. And I also wanted to know, what are some links, some story? I'm saying links. What are some links that you clicked?
Some links that I clicked.
Some stories that you found to really be interesting, either in the food media world or food adjacent.
Well, you know, the food media world sort of loves nothing more than to look at itself, and I'm definitely guilty of that. And I like writing about food media also. I mean, like I said, I kind of end up inadvertently doing what's like effectively media reporting and writing about restaurant critics and things like that. But I was speaking earlier today with a friend about this piece that HuffPo ran back in October that I think didn't get enough attention. It wasn't, I think, in like their food section, which maybe is why it missed a lot of people's radars. But they did this incredible stunt that my friend was saying was like worthy of Spy magazine at its finest, which it absolutely was, where they called a whole bunch of high-end New York restaurants and pretended to be Harvey Weinstein's personal assistant. And were like, Mr. Weinstein would like to come in tonight. Do you have a table for 4? And like recorded how all of these fancy New York restaurants responded or failed to respond to this. And it was fucking incredible. I mean, it was hilarious and like ballsy as hell, and just exactly the kind of brilliant, like, you know, put your money where your mouth is. Like, we talk all day, all fucking day about, you know, what is the responsibility of like a diner, a chef, an operator, a restaurateur, a critic, like, but this is just absolutely like brass tacks. Like, will you let this man into your restaurant? And they called Danielle, they called Blue Hill at Stone Barns, they called Minetta Tavern, and almost everybody, like, in some way, shape, or form was able to get a table for him. There were a couple of people who didn't, and I wish I could remember who they were so that I could, like, laud them on this podcast episode. But, you know, I remember, like, Stone Barns is one of my favorite restaurants in the world, and I think Dan Barber is a genius, and I think that what they do is a moral good as well as a culinary good. And yet, when some person from Huffington Post called them up at, like, 2 p.m. and said, I'm calling on behalf of Harvey Weinstein, do you have room for 4 people tonight for him? They were like, yep, we can fit him in at 8 p.m. And, you know, I mean, I don't know if you've ever tried to get a reservation there, but that's like a 3 or 4 month out process.
Yeah.
So, you know, it was like, makes you think.
Yeah,
you know?
I wonder.
Like,
I would like to go back and read that story and see how they actually phrased it. And just really, I think it's great that you bring that up because I was unfamiliar with that story.
And like, it's one of those things where like it's really funny, it's really fucking ballsy, it's super stunty, and it reveals the darkness of everybody. You know, I mean, we all have these disgusting, dripping, blackened souls, and like it's right there. The Minetta Tavern one in particular too, and like,
oh yeah, fuck that.
They were like, I guess the way the receptionist or the reservationist responded to that call was like, oh, this isn't the number he usually calls from. He usually calls from the office. And the HuffPo person was like, oh yeah, like some excuse, like we're calling from another phone or something. And they were like, okay, cool. Well, I see here that like what Mr. like, you know, it's
whoa, like they hadn't even opened up a paper. I had no idea.
They were just like, you know, like we can see here that like, you know, Mr. Weinstein prefers to like sit at such and such a table and do da. So I think we can accommodate that. And like, it was all right there. And this also dovetails with my own personal interest in the sort of secret parallel sphere that the wealthy and powerful inhabit. You know, that like we walk around in our regular lives and they have this whole other universe with like secret phone numbers and
no
like,
fucking rules. How about
no
that?
fucking rules. And like reservationists who remember that they like sparkling water, and like nobody ever remembers that I like sparkling water. And like, what is that like? And also you can be Harvey Weinstein and still get a table on 4 hours notice at Blue Hill at Stone Barns.
Speaking of Anita, I had her on the podcast.
Oh, Anita Lowe.
Anita Lowe. And sorry, the segue is this, and it's related to restaurants and their secret weird world. You tweeted "Close the Damn Restaurant" about the Spotted Pig, and I brought it up to Anita in a live event, conversation at Books Are Magic. We talked about it. It's great. Go back. It's a couple podcasts back of this one, but hey, that restaurant's still open. What's up with that?
The Spotted Pig?
Yeah.
I don't know. There are complicated forces behind everything, I think is the short answer. And you know, Babbo is still open too. And I think some of it might be because the demand is there, and some of that might be because its proprietors don't want to close it. But I think there's also like, they have leases and they have financial obligations, and they might have investors who are like fucking furious about everything that's happened, but are also like, don't want to cut and run yet. I mean, I have gotten a lot of flack for that tweet that I put out. Like, I think you know, when it was announced that Gabrielle Hamilton was going to be partnering with Ken Friedman, and that, of course, ended up being sort of an abortive partnership. But I tweeted, just shut the fucking restaurant down. Not to backtrack on that sentiment, because I believe it fully and forcefully.
Good,
but like,
I
meant it.
I felt like you were backtracking.
No, well, what I was going to say is like, I meant it in a sort of glib and fairly rhetorical way. Like,
hey, Twitter, how about that?
Right. But like, you can't just shut a restaurant down any more than like you can say like, you know, like we're going to cut off diplomatic relationships with France. Like, these things are complicated.
Well said.
And,
yep. That's true.
Even if I want to be able to just like, you know, drop a portcullis down over the door and be like, fuck all y'all, like, that's just not how it works. It's not how real estate works. It's not how businesses work. It's not how the culture of this sort of retail situation works. Yeah, it's still open, but I don't think that means anything.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It actually, the symbol of it open, it doesn't take anything away from the writing and reporting that's been happening and will continue to happen into 2019.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, like, I don't think that people should be outraged that it remains open. I think they should be outraged if it continues to remain open without Friedman making any gestures towards making amends or reparations for what he's done, or if like celebrities start flocking to it, or if, you know, some TV producer decides we're going to set a TV show there. I mean, like, those are things to start interrogating and becoming concerned about. But the mere persistence of something is like, you know, I don't think getting angry on Twitter has ever really shut down a restaurant, and I don't think it should. I don't know. It's all complicated.
2019 may offer a little more clarity into this topic.
I don't know.
Of closing restaurants for bad people.
I have no idea. I genuinely don't know. I was just reading today Pete Wells' review of the Four Seasons, which, you know, ran in the beginning of December, where he opens with 5 paragraphs outlining all of the legal and social complaints that have been levied against Julia Nicolini, who's the maitre d' at the Four Seasons and who has been sued multiple times by female employees for harassment and discrimination, and also wound up pleading guilty to a charge of assault when he groped a female patron and she called the cops on him in the restaurant. And the restaurant, of course, closed for a while, and now the grill is open where it used to be, and the Four Seasons recently reopened in this new space. And, you know, Pete's review opens with the assaults. You know, it opens with the litany of negative attention that this guy, through his chosen actions, has brought upon himself and his business and his employees. And I don't think that restaurant's going to close. You know, when Hannah Goldfield, the critic who I work with at the New Yorker, wrote her review, she mentioned that when she was there for one of her review meals, she was in the dining room with Henry Kissinger at one table and Charlie Rose at another. So you know, I guess there needs to be a clubhouse for assholes, right? Fine, they've got their room, you can go there. But I don't know. I don't want it to be illegal to be an asshole. I just want it.
They have their club.
I just don't want it to carry a reward.
Do you have big stories that you're working on for 2019?
Yeah, but I'm not going to tell you about them.
Hint?
No, it's jinxing everything.
Okay. Helen Rosner, thank you for joining today's podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Here's Anna speaking with food media watchdog Josh G.
Josh G., you are one of the people I know who probably is the most well-read on the subject of food. You're not a food writer or editor in the traditional sense. Can you tell us where you work?
I actually work at the MTA.
Ooh.
Yes, I'm very excited to get all of your feedback about the state of the subways. So send it my way.
You also have a really smart, incisive, really comprehensive, often very funny newsletter called Snack Cart, which is kind of a digest once a month or so of everything that's happening in food. Food reviews from Los Angeles to Chicago, DC, Boston, New York. So you, more than anyone else I know, have a sense of what has happened in food this year. What were the big things? What are the big movements this year?
Yeah, I think this year, it's hard to talk about this year without talking about a bit of a changing of the guard we've seen. The obvious huge events were the death of Anthony Bourdain and Jonathan Gold, who were two of the most influential to me personally writers and in the food world. I think they were, partly with them, partly with some other folks stepping down. The food critic for San Francisco, whose name escapes me for a second, stepped down. We've kind of seen a turnover in some of the food voices that I think we in the media really, people in food media love. But in the wake of that, some of them are sad, some of them are people who it's time for them to go. We've seen a real rise in a new class of amazing voices, and I think that's been really exciting. People like Samin Nosrat with Hot Salt Fat Acid Heat as a sort of a breakout TV star. Helen Rosner at the New Yorker, sort of in this sort of essayist thought place. Mayunk Sen, who's writing all over the place, but really came out of, I think, Food 52 and is now just sort of everywhere.
He was at Food 52 and then Munchies, and he's written for Taste Plenty and for the New York Times.
And, of course, Alison Roman, who just, you cannot go on Instagram without seeing something that she has cooked. I think that's been really exciting nationally, and hopefully 2019 we'll see that keep trickling down sort of the local level. I mean, we already saw that with Soliel Ho, the new critic in San Francisco as well. So it's been very sad to see some of these voices sort of go silent, but the new class is hopefully going to tell newer stories and explore parts of food we haven't heard before. Yeah,
there are a lot of questions right now about who will be the next Bourdain, who will be the next Gold. but also kind of like if we need new versions of them or if it's kind of like time for a new model and just who will sort of step up and be the big voices.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually it was funny. I was just listening to Carb Face Pod yesterday with Samin Nosrat, and she was saying she doesn't necessarily think of herself as the next Bourdain, though certainly that's been bandied about. I would say that I think, and I wrote about this in the newsletter, I think sort of all those voices take us to a place where these new voices could come from, right? I think especially with someone like Jonathan Gold, he sort of won, right? 30 years ago, he was writing about taco stands and, Chinese restaurants in the middle of the San Gabriel Valley, and everyone was saying, that's weird, this eccentric guy. And now that's pretty much normal. That's what food writing is, and that's what people think about. And I think that completely transformed food writing in all but except for a few holdouts. I think same with Anthony Bourdain. It's like food TV completely changed from where it was before he started to where it after he started. And I don't think we're going to go back to what it was before. So hopefully I think, rather than a new version of each of them, we're just going to see new voices in a world that they helped create.
Definitely. On the subject of Jonathan Gold, I think part of surfacing some of those smaller local businesses, part of what's interesting about that is that especially in the last 10 years, it's so easy to just Google a city and find out like the biggest, flashiest, most popular quote unquote restaurants. But it takes a little more work to kind of like do the legwork to find like the smaller local places that might not be new, they might not be fancy, they might not be flashy, but that are really, really good food.
No, I think that's right. And I think part of what he did is make it a little bit easier for those places to get the respect they deserve. I mean, even in the New York Times, a lot of media outlets have sort of stopped having their separate cheap eats column or their ethnic. I mean, that concept is just gone. Yeah. And I think he put them on equal footing as the new flashy places. I advocate for this a lot in my newsletter when I write about different reviews and stuff that these places should be highlighted and considered the same as you would a new opening from a hot chef. But I hopefully that criticism is tempered by I know how hard that is. It's so hard to be aware of not just the hot new opening and this stuff that PR agents will send you, but also trolling blogs, trolling Twitter accounts, trolling message boards to find out, this Burmese place that just opened up in the middle of Ridgewood is totally worth checking out. So
definitely.
Yeah.
And I think it even takes going to those, actually visiting those neighborhoods and walking around sometimes, because there are sometimes little family owned places that don't have a website or they haven't really been written about even by blogs. And so it's just an incredible amount of work. But the people who do it and who pull it off turn out to write great stories.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you see that here in New York. There's a great profile in Vice of Lagaya Michon recently that was just talking about how she's really viewed it as her mission to tell some of those stories about not just these restaurants, but the people behind them, right? I mean, 2018 followed 2017 as a tough year with a tough political environment. And I think especially in the food world, I think you saw a lot of people trying to embrace in our own way immigrant stories, marginalized communities, underrepresented communities, intersectionality, things that, I think food, everyone's beginning to realize that food is a bit of everything and everything penetrates into food, but food also penetrates into everything. And I think we saw that more with more things that you wouldn't necessarily call food writing that were food writing. Or you may not have called food writing 5 years ago.
Definitely. So this year also was the first year you lived in New York, right? You moved to New York this year.
Yeah. You had emailed me before. You were like, what are some of your favorite restaurants this year? And
where have you eaten? I mean, even cool restaurants, uncool restaurants. Where do you like eating in New York so far?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I don't know if listeners are interested in the quest to find the perfect Chinese food takeout, which is an ongoing effort whenever you move somewhere.
Definitely.
But I moved into Crown Heights, which has been awesome for me. I've gotten to learn a lot about West Indian food, Trinidadian food. You introduced me to doubles, which I'd never had before, which was super exciting.
At Gloria's, right?
Yeah, I've had them at Gloria's. I've gotten them at a few other spots, A&A doubles. In terms of fancy places, I was very lucky to go to Shabu Shabu Macaron once this year, which was probably one of the best just food experiences I've had in a really long time. If you haven't had a chance to go,
I haven't. What is it like?
It's a little small place in Lower East Side. It's it's basically just this one woman. It's 12 seats around a bar, and it's kind of like a high-end sushi place, but it's actually hot pot. So she is, a very traditionally casual way of eating, where you take meat or vegetables and dunk them in a bowl of broth. But she's kind of doing it for you as elevated as that form of food can go, and it's also completely delightful. I started following her on Instagram afterwards, and she seems completely overwhelmed by her own fame, which is adorable and awesome. It's just a very intimate experience. It's a lot of fun in a way. You could think it would be stodgy, but it's an incredible amount of fun. It's basically a single person working behind the counter doing, I think, 2 seatings a night, and maybe one of the more special things I got to experience this year, which was super fun.
That's really cool. I was talking to Amanda Cohen on the podcast recently about how tasting menus, like, you kind of have to have fun with them and have a sense of humor, because otherwise you're just kind of trapping someone in a restaurant for a few hours.
Yeah, I think that's right. I always go, it's so fun. I came from a family that was very into food, which is how I got into it. My grandparents and my parents, but they were very, they hated the concept of tasting menus. And I think it's been interesting to see. I think you see a lot of chefs sort of veering back and forth between wanting to do them to show that you're a big deal, but also recognizing that for a lot of guests, it's very intimidating. It's not necessarily the most fun. It can be monotonous. I mean, for every transcendental Alinea experience, you have 14 courses I can't remember the difference of, right? And so, especially for folks who might want to, Tuesday night, glass of wine and dinner, you're not going to go do that for 14 courses somewhere.
Definitely. Where else have you eaten that you liked?
Other places I've eaten this year, I was lucky enough this year to go to. It's fun. I write about a lot of these restaurants that I never get to go to because I cover a lot of different cities in the newsletter. This year, I was lucky enough to go back to LA, where I used to live. I can never go to LA without eating at Chitlada. I feel like everyone who's gone to LA has gone. If you go to LA and don't go, you are committing criminal malfeasance. It continues to be just probably the best Thai restaurant in America, maybe the world. Including Thailand. It's unfortunately, I believe it was this year that the head chef who opened it passed away. The loss of a kind of not a celebrity chef per se, but one who was absolutely beloved by the community. That being said, the food is still excellent. The team that is there have been doing this for a long time. Also, your best place if you visit LA to see a celebrity, because they all go there. I also got to go to Chicago, where I could eat at Hai Sauce, which was a new Vietnamese restaurant in. I'm so bad at Chicago neighborhoods because I don't live there. The Logan Square area. Really great place, newer. I think there's kind of been a spate of newer sort of higher end Asian restaurants in Chicago, which isn't always the most out there and adventurous food city. So that's been, I think, a really neat trend there.
That's great. What were some pieces that you read this year that really stuck with you over the course of the year that you think you'll be thinking about next year?
Yeah, I think I've got a couple of individual pieces. I would say one thing that will definitely be sticking with me is a lot of the pop-up sort of media outlets that have started this year. I feel like in this year, the New York Times did a big profile on it, kind of around over the summer, especially in food media. You saw, I think, filling the gap that a lot of sort of legacy brands that maybe in 2017 didn't make it out of 2017. We had pop-up magazines, Dill, Cherry Bomb, even honestly places like Taste or Food 52 stepping up into that void with more interesting and engaging content. So subscribing to fancy artisanal magazines is my passion, and my girlfriend really wants me to stop, but I will not. Individual pieces, it's pretty tough to talk about this year. Everything that was written in Jonathan Gold, every obituary of Jonathan Gold was amazing. So, everyone in the food world wanted to contribute their own memory and some of the stories. Everyone
had a wild story about just meeting him up, getting picked up in his truck.
Totally. It was I feel like for a degree, it was how you made it. I was also amazed at the degree to which everyone seemed to have a favorite article of his or a review, and how few of them were the same. Everyone seemed to have different things, and that was just a chance to reread a lot of his classics, but also, just some of, obituaries tend to inspire amazing writing. And so unfortunately, we lost some really great people who inspired that. Other trends this year, you would, maybe a story, but you can't talk about this year without hairdryer chicken and talking about Helen, her story about that. If you have heard about hairdryer chicken, you need to really go back and read her New Yorker piece about what it was like to be in the center of that and how sort of
people got so mad kind of all of the extreme emotions, like really excited about that, really angry.
People freaked out, and it's really hard to look at it without, I think she mentioned, she calls it out a little bit, and it's really hard not to notice that, a woman doing something like that, something that Alton Brown would have done, and be called like a super cool genius kitchen hack, because it totally works. By the way, I did it for Thanksgiving. It's amazing. Mm-hmm. She was not allowed. She necessarily wasn't allowed to, and especially as it got more and more viral. So definitely check that out. Also, if you're making fried chicken or any kind of chicken, you should totally do it. There was another great story that I don't know didn't get as much attention, but I really, really enjoyed. I might get this name wrong, but Andy Barangni, he did his piece for Bon Appetit on cooking and identity. That was kind of about how when he started cooking, it sort of enabled him to embrace both his sort of, his identity as gay and also his identity as an Iranian, and sort of talk more about really discovering who he was and embracing who he was, things he hadn't been proud of himself till he started cooking. And I just thought there were kind of a lot of stories like that this year that I really, really liked.
Definitely. The story behind the kind of creative mind who's creating these recipes.
Totally, right? And how, making stuff can help us. And I certainly feel this way about something as silly as my newsletter, but making things can help you explore a little bit about who you are and find parts of yourself you didn't have before. Also, late in the year, but a pace, and I'm not just totally being a homer, but it's something that stuck with me a lot, is that, especially I think for people who read a lot of food media, we think of food stories like that and say, oh, it's this amazing thing. You guys on Taste published a piece that I thought was really amazing. I cannot remember the author's name, but it was "What If Food Doesn't Bring Us Together?"
Oh, yeah, by Tina Vasquez, who is a reporter who writes about immigration a lot. And she wrote this essay about being a Latino woman who moves to North Carolina and kind of experiences racism firsthand and sees kind of the strengths but also the shortcomings of food as a way to kind of create community and break through boundaries. Yeah,
I think that was really good. I mean, I really like that as a counter to, I think, a lot of food media, certainly something like people talk about Anthony Bourdain a lot in this vein, or the cliche of if we all sit around a table and break bread together, everything will be okay. And I thought that piece was a really needed and maybe not talked about enough corrective to that idea. You can enjoy someone's food and not enjoy them as a person, and not accept them for who they are. And I thought she explored that very poignantly, and it was a sort of depressing but also really well told note to include. So those are some of the ones that jumped out at me as I was thinking about it. There's been probably been some others, but
definitely. Well, yeah, there have been hundreds of others, right. I'm sure. But what do you want to read more of in 2019? What gets you really excited when you see it pop up on the New York Times cooking section or Bon Appetit homepage?
Yeah, totally. Probably, I'm excited to see more of. I'm obsessed with. I mean, one of the reasons I do the newsletter is how much I have a love of local media and local cities. I'm hoping that more of this kind of either intersectionality, either sort of more of this kind. I mean, some of the local cities haven't quite gotten into embrace the Jonathan Gold, everything deserves to be the level of everything is worthy of exploration. Mm-hmm. I'm hoping we'll see more of that. I'm hoping we'll see more reviews. I mean, I know reviews are expensive. They're hard, but I do think they are important, especially in a world in which we're struggling to now do reviews in the wake of a lot of the sort of Me Too and horrible things of 2017 that continued to 2018 and will continue forever. But I think this is a time when we need reviews more, not less, because they're harder to make and because we're trying to put food and restaurants into increasing context. And that's so I'm hoping more national outlets will try that, and I'm hoping more local outlets will embrace sort of those trends.
I have to ask, so when you're reading really local news coverage, really local restaurant reviews of a city that you don't live in, what makes a good review? What makes a review that's actually entertaining and interesting to you as someone who might possibly not even ever eat at that restaurant?
That is a really good point. And I would say it definitely, first of all, it takes a couple of months of reading them to get the scene a little bit. You start to reference, I mean, especially understanding restaurant reviews are very heavily based on cities. So they'll use neighborhoods as shorthands. They'll use restaurant groups as shorthands. And it took a while to be I don't know where that place is or what this means, right? if you didn't know what Williamsburg meant, half the reviews don't make any sense. I think a great review does two things in my mind. It gives a really good sense of place, right? Like I don't have to be there, but I can imagine myself there or understand there. And it makes me understand something better than I would have otherwise. Maybe it's more universal. I think that I was obsessed with Roger Ebert when I was younger. And he talked about that a critic's job was to understand what the artist is trying to do better than the artists themselves and to put that artist's work into context. And I think even in some of the Jonathan Gold, I remember Roy Choi saying this in his obituary, that he said Jonathan Gold got what I was doing more so than I did. I was just making tacos, and he really saw where that fit. And I think a really great review, and like that's hard to do, but a really great review does that. A really great review helps me understand food better, a place better, a person better, and more so than just, and I think I've now written a few reviews myself, more so than just, come here, get the chicken, don't get the fish, or the service is kind of meh. That stuff is fun to read. And obviously it's very fun to read a negative review every once in a while, but like it's more fun to learn something.
That's one thing I always think must be so hard about national restaurant critics' jobs, like people like Bill Addison who travel all over the country and have to really sum up the best restaurants in the country or the best restaurants in every city. It just seems so hard to so quickly get a sense of the context and the neighborhood and kind of like the history of a place that might make one restaurant taste great in Seattle, but like maybe it just wouldn't work as well in Brooklyn, for instance.
Totally. I don't know how they do it, and I think it's tough. Bill Addison does an amazing job. National reviews are tough. I would say that I think often it's like I think they fall prey to trying to make a narrative, right? You're looking for a trend story and you start calling out certain kinds of restaurants and you notice something that like every time I see national reviews, as someone who reads a lot of local ones, I think, and everyone feels this about their own city. Oh, why'd they review this place and not this place that's way better down the street or something like that? And I think, a local reviewer is looking at the whole city and trying to create a picture for you and call out trends and call out things. A national reviewer is doing that 10,000 feet up and trying to do it in ways that may give short shrift or not be as good as the local might be able to. But yeah, but it does maybe give them a taste for the novel, a thing that is more interesting, right? I mean, I think one of the best of lists, the only Boston restaurant that was on there was a noodle place that had just opened, like in the middle of Cambridge, that like was certainly known in Boston, but not on like the list of places in Boston that are amazing. And I think it was really interesting to see. I think it was Bonap's Best New Restaurants, to see it highlighted in that way. But I think it's just because it was so novel, because it was a particular kind of noodles and a particular guy, right, that it broke out nationally, even if it wasn't that interesting locally.
Another thing I've noticed, like maybe this is kind of specific to New York, but since there's so many restaurants in New York, I feel like reviewers feel obligated to kind of like create this hyperbole to make the review interesting. So you either get like a really over the top good review, like this is the best thing I ever ate, or you get a review that's like talking about how you paid $100 for something that tastes like cat food. And you never read, I mean, those are always really entertaining to read, but you never read like an entertaining kind of like middling review of a restaurant.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard. I mean, I think it's a lot of critics aspire to be Jonathan Gold in some ways, but like they don't just give out those Pulitzer Prizes, right? It's like it's that context thing. I mean, Pete Wells, the New York Times food critic, gets a lot of he's frequently critiqued that he gives everything 2 stars, but I kind of feel like you eat around New York City and a lot of things are like, pretty good.
Yeah, totally.
Pretty good. Not amazing, pretty good. And like, I think that's maybe there's a jaded New Yorker degree to that, or maybe there's a jaded food scenester thing, right? I mean, we're all becoming food critics in our own way, and we're all getting used to trends and noticing them and stuff like that. But it's I think it does make it after a while. I think it makes it very hard to differentiate or call things out. It all starts to feel the same, especially the life of a food critic. I mean, you mentioned Bill Addison. He's eating 4 or 5 times a day, every day, traveling around the world, around the country. Mm-hmm. Even a local critic, you're eating out 5 to 6 nights a week, sometimes twice. And that's just hard.
Yeah, it's hard for anything to kind of stand out when you're so exhausted from eating.
Yeah, right?
Yeah. So it's almost the end of the year. We have like a few more days before the end of the year. What are your cooking goals for 2019? Are you gonna learn? Do you have anything like any recipes saved? Anything you want to cook this winter?
Yeah, I mean, my main cooking goals for 2019 are to start cooking at all. Because I moved to New York, I spent most of this year living in like a tiny studio that had like a hot plate and one of the half fridge things. So I really didn't do a lot of cooking. So now I have a real kitchen. I just spent way too much ordering an industrial kitchen prep table that I love like my own child, and for my kitchen. But I'm still in that phase of new apartment where every new recipe costs $1 million because I have to buy all the spices for the first time. So like,
totally.
Use a teaspoon of turmeric. It's like, okay, that will be $10 worth of turmeric that I will use.
That margin will go down
Exactly,
as you accrue
yeah.
spices.
So building out a pantry, kind of getting to a place where I can make an interesting recipe that I saw without having to start from scratch. Like I've only been in Brooklyn like 9 months, but like pickling, that's a thing I'm going to do. I'm going to be that guy. I'm very excited to pickle some stuff.
Welcome to Brooklyn.
Thank you.
Welcome to the club.
Thank you very much. Super excited. Maybe even make my own kombucha, but if that happens, please do call the authorities or something.
Josh, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's a real honor.
The Taste Podcast is hosted by Matt Rodbard and me, Anna Heasel. The show is produced by Gabrielle Lewis, studio recordings by Pat Stango, theme music by Steve Rydell. Interviews are recorded live at Books Are Magic in Cobble Hill, Brooklyn, and at Penguin Random House Studios in Manhattan. Visit Taste online at tastecooking.com. Thanks for listening.